Anindita Mukhopadhyay is a professor in the Department of History at the University of Hyderabad. She specializes in modern Indian history and is interested in cultural identities, intellectual and legal histories, and the political domains of text and translation. She is the author of Behind the Mask, The Cultural Identity of the Legal Subject in Colonial Bengal, 1776 to 1911, published by the Oxford University Press in 2006, and Children's Games, Adults Gambits, From Vidyasagar to Satyajit Ray, published by Orion Black Swan in 2019, and has published in journals such as Studies in History and the Economic and Political Weekly. Professor Mukhopadhyay has also translated the works of Rabindranath Tagore and Sharat Chandra Chattopadhyay. A translation of Sharat Chandra's short stories, published by Rupa, received the Sharat Puraskar in 2022. Her lecture today is titled Education and Rammohun Roy. Over to you, Professor Mukhopadhyay.
Thank you very much. I am honored to get this forum to talk. And Rammohun Roy has been part of all historians' repertoire. And especially, I'm going to use a word which I haven't used in the title, Western education and advocacy in English education especially has been a fairly well understood strength of Rammohun Roy's petitions. However, I want to push this a little beyond Western education, though I will stick to some understanding of Western education as Roy understood it. And I would like to understand education as a slightly more open term. And I would like to use education vis-a-vis Western education as the point of departure for this particular lecture. I have some reasons for doing this. There have been very important scholarly contributions by young scholars, and one of them is Shomik Dasgupta, who has looked at the ethical dimensions of Rammohun's thought, political thought, and his understanding of a certain kind of indigenous, I wouldn't call it citizenship, he wouldn't call it either, but call it indigenous subjecthood. And here, I think we can talk in terms of a broader understanding of education and not just the Western education, which has been held up time and again by the historians of Indian colonial modernity. So without more ado, I would like to start on a time-tested beginning, which is Rammohun Roy's position and positioning in early 19th century. Raja Rammohun Roy has been written about, analyzed and cited as the first modern man of India. Much of these writings about Roy are preserved in the annals of the proselytizing missions of Western Christianity. We must remember that the early 19th century was dominated by predominantly religious worldviews, and Christianity and Christian intellectuals was a very important frame. Roy had taken on this particular frame head on, and this had given rise to an enormous storm in the press, which had been established in Calcutta by this time, by early 19th century. The Christian missionaries, as well as intellectuals, who had sought to reframe the truth of the divine Godhead for the natives and obviously for the task of bringing them to the path of light, actually had major confrontations with Roy. And Roy, however, though arriving at his certain theoretical takes on uh, the Catholic Church and his understanding of the Trinity, was actually supported by the Unitarian Church and very powerful voices coming out of the Unitarian Church. But far more importantly, he did have a very important similarity which he drew uh, as idolatrous and iconographic Christian symbols vis-a-vis the iconography and idolatry of Hinduism. So it was here that we actually begin to see a highly rational, very critical Rammohun Roy, who is and I'm going to have this particular understanding of self-education, not an institutionalized understanding of education, but self-education, which is part of a rather individualistic positioning of education, which is not Western in this sense. It is deriving certain ideas from contact with the West, but it is definitely indigenous and certainly highly individualistic. Uh, However, um, there is over and above his individualistic understanding of uh, the frames of debate in colonial Bengal, we also see a very high visibility for Roy, which is perhaps because he does have a impact in the Western world. In Britain, as well as in America, the Unitarian Church picks up Roy as a foreign supporter of their ideas vis-a-vis the Catholic Church, vis-a-vis Trinitarianism, and because of this very high visibility, one does have Roy being singled out as a very unique figure in the early 19th century. What I would like to say here is that perhaps Roy was not really one of a kind. We have similar voices coming out of closer to Bengal, closer home. We have in Assam Holy Ram Dhekial Fukan. We also have Gunabhiram Barua, both in the early part of the 19th century, who are looking at the interface between Western education and English education and the power of the press to begin to bridge the gap between their traditional worlds and the new world, which is beginning to emerge through colonialism. So here, I would say that again, we do not have institutionalized Western education, though most of these new moderns, if you like, would be advocating institutionalization of education following the newly stated policy of the East India Company in Bengal. And there is also therefore similar concerns. I would like to underline here that Roy is in this sense not unique in his time, nor is he unique in his insistence about certain social reforms uh, which would allow the indigenous societies to emerge out of their rather narrow worlds and join the larger world, uh, as moderns, right? So there is this turning of the word of the word modern, and what it entails to position oneself within it. And I would like to again insist that even in the early 19th century, one does not have only Roy. One actually has also different regions, and just adjacent to Bengal, you have the Assamese intellectuals beginning to talk about a new modernity, beginning to talk about a new kind of location, also beginning to talk about a new kind of positioning within the larger world, the global context, as it were. So it is in this sense that education, again, breaking out of a conventional understanding of an institutional setup, is turning back on the quests of the self. There is a self evolution. There is also, side by side with this, self education, which is bringing on very, very rapidly certain kinds of critical location, a very self-critical location within the 19th century time frame. Here, I would like to very quickly refer to Sumit Sarkar's very, very critical essay, Rammohun Roy and the Break from Tradition, where he is very, very sharply critical of Roy's two phases. And I think this is very important because he also, without calling Rammohun Roy's forays into the world of thought educational, he does understand some very important phases. The first phase, which lasts till about from 1804, 1803, 1804 to about 1814, 1815, where you have the Persian and the Arabic world kind of highlighted by his major early work, Tufat ul Muwahidin, roughly written around 1804, which was a very, very rational, very skeptical understanding, critical understanding of a religious positioning. Sumit Sarkar claims, and rightly so, that his later post 1816 thoughts beginning to veer towards new worlds of knowledge systems, new worlds of ideas and clashes of identities begin to take him away from this older indigenous secular rational thread, which would have possibly led him to really, really radical arrivals, intellectual arrivals. And this is Sumit Sarkar's morning note, which looks at his 1816, post-1816 development, vis-a-vis the missionaries, vis-a-vis his engagement with missionary attack on Hinduism. And it is from here, from this point, that his intellectual venture into the defense of Hinduism as a non-idolatrous, non-polytheistic, philosophical thought, philosophical set of ideas which dwelt upon the nature of the the divine as fairly close to that of either Islamic or to the Unitarian understanding of the divine, the nature of the divine. And uh, Sumit Sarkar would point to this shift from the earlier, far more radical position. I will just quote Sumit Sarkar in this particular essay, Rammohun Roy and the Break with the Past. Um, um, Give to tastes or Tufat ul Muwahidin was marked by a radicalism trenchant enough to embarrass many later admirers. Here, the criteria of reason and social comfort are used with devastating effect to establish the startling proposition that falsehood is common to all religions without distinction. Only three basic tenets, common to all faiths and hence natural, are retained: belief in a single creator, uh, in the existence of the soul, and faith in an afterworld where rewards and punishments will be duly awarded. So, this is where Sumit Sarkar feels that the deeper connection to indigenous creativity is beginning to be taken over by a colonial clouding of the intellect, where education is beginning to veer off. Self education, self search, reflexivity are beginning to veer off towards more religious and a more conventional path, which it will get stuck on. It will not actually ever revert back to the earlier creativity of 1804, 1810, that particular radical phase. And Sumit Sarkar also says that despite his many translations of his own works, despite his constant revisiting his own works, the Tuhfat was never really at any point picked up as a very major work, even by Roy. So perhaps Sumit Sarkar assumes or he kind of hypothesizes that Rammohun Roy himself was a little alarmed at the logical conclusion of his initial foray into rationality, into pure rationality, devoid of this religious foundation, which would take him to a world without religion, without any religion, without any comfortable notion of the divine at all. So self-education, in this sense, or self-reflexivity in this sense, quickly retreated from this position and tried to find rationality within more tried and tested a foundational understanding of religious philosophy. Right. Now, to come to a more conventional understanding of education post 1816, which again Sumit Sarkar has heavily criticized, which of course has been echoed and sharply illustrated in Gauri Vishwanathan's work. English does have, in this sense, a very important colonial agenda, and advocacy of English does have, again, a deeper colonial enterprise, a deeper colonial implication, colonized implication within this. And here, obviously, the presence of the East India Company, as well as the presence of the missionaries make the presence of especially the English culture and the English nation very powerful, and looming presences within the 19th century Indian context. And within this rather overpoweringly, sharp discourses emanating both from the East India Company portals as well as the pens of the missionaries, there is a scathing attack on the morality of the indigenous literate population. Here, perhaps one does not even look at the quote unquote the masses, but as we all know, the missionary as well as the administrative discourse was always focused on the communities that could be described as literate, and it was in their literacy and the fact that they both the Muslims as well as the Hindus actually could claim very deep civilizational and cultural sophistication. It was at these literate communities that the most scathing attacks were launched, and especially singled out in Bengal were the Hindu were the Hindus who were morally understood to be deficient, who were apathetic, morbid, and without any uh, without any quote unquote without any deliverance from quote unquote universal corruption of manners. Before I proceed, I just want to say that I'm using the original works of Rammohun Roy, very easily available on net. So I have used Roy's voice, his comments and his words wherever possible. I'm not going to rely on my paraphrasing. I'm going to rely on Roy's own way with words. Right. What I would like to say here, so this is Rammohun, Collected Works of Rammohun Roy, Volume 1, Asian Publications. I would like to say here that against this kind of attack, Rammohun Roy does show a certain kind of angry loyalty. Um, why I call it angry is because there is a sneaking concession in his other writings scattered across these collected volumes, which show that what he actually says in rebuttal of the accusations of moral death, universal corruption of manners, morbid apathy, and lack of thought. He has he certainly has a very defensive and I would say um, against his more sound judgment. He does have a certain support. He does give a certain support to quote unquote indigenous learning, and I would like to read this. Um, During only a few years past, thousands of works on different subjects, such as theology, law, logic, grammar, and astronomy, have been written by the natives of Bengal alone. I do not wonder that they have not reached the knowledge of the editor, who, in common with all his colleagues, has shut his eyes against anything that might do the smallest credit to the natives. As to the moral death ascribed to them by the editor, I might easily draw a comparison between the domestic conduct of the natives and that of the inhabitants of Europe to show where the grossest deficiency lies. Against this angry response, however, there are scattered across many of his writings his deep anguish around the superstitious irrationalities of even highly educated natives. And especially his assessment of their academic, or shall we say scholarly, output. Um, and here I would just um, pause for a second before going to his petition for English education. Before that, I would just like to pause and um, qualify this particular loyalty to indigenous scholarship, um, prolific indigenous scholarship, which I would understand as more emotional than cerebral. Um, uh, I think this is an extremely important moment where a certain understanding of power, a certain understanding of uh, domination, uh, is making Roy respond to this particular denigration of Indian academic output, right? Okay, so there is this very clear, I think, a very clear recognition that Western knowledge systems, Western values, under no circumstances should be allowed to downgrade Indian scholarly production, nor should it downgrade the cultural identity of Indians. I think this is really, really very important, which Sarkar in Rammohun Roy and the Break with the Past does not really recognize. There is, despite his beginning to turn towards a new kind of colonial hegemony, there is even at this moment there is resistance, right? And this is resistance. This is resistance to knowledge power domination. Uh, it is at this point that while obviously I cannot bring back the Tufat in the next phase of Rammohun Roy's Uber. But I would still like to say that there is, in the phase 1816 to 1823, 1824, here, in spite of his understanding of English education as the only possible way out of the quagmire of shall we call it misguided education. So this is what I think we will need to look at, what he would understand in his more cerebral takes on indigenous, on the status of indigenous academic output, scholarly output, uh, uh, there is a very clear there is a very clear um, intimation that two things were beginning to dictate to Roy. Um, the possibility of um, uh, allowing some kind of independent, rational uh, empowerment for Indians. Um, and here, I'm not going to talk in terms of just plain English education, right? But I would like to draw certain uh, um, I would like to draw certain conclusions from his petition when he was asking the colonial administration to rethink its educational policy and refund its money and not waste it on Sanskrit education. And I think this is a very important petition, but which has slightly different, slightly different implications than what Sumit Sarkar would talk about as false consciousness, right? I think this is very important. I quote, "The establishment of a new Sanskrit school in Calcutta evinces the laudable desire of the government to improve the natives of India by education, a blessing that should be guided by the most enlightened principles, so that the stream of intelligence may flow in the most useful channels." I would like to underline these two phrases. Stream of intelligence may flow in the most useful channels. And the other one is the establishment of a new Sanskrit school in Calcutta. I'm talking about two things. I'm talking about uh, uh, number one, a new kind of understanding of institutionalized education, not just education, but institutionalized education, which has been said many times before also, but also the fact that there has to be a materialist engagement with empowering the intellect, right? It cannot just be a metaphysical debate on very sophisticated, highly abstract principles. Um, so to continue, Roy detached the actual establishment of the Sanskrit college, which in his reading was disappointing. Instead, he underlined the undergirding implication of having an educational institution or institutionalization on the Western model. Said he, "We were filled with sanguine hopes that this sum would be laid out in employing European gentlemen of talent and education to instruct the natives of India in mathematics, natural philosophy, chemistry, anatomy, and other useful sciences, which the natives of Europe have carried to a degree of perfection that has raised them above the inhabitants of the other parts of the world." Roy obviously did not labor under any illusions of the usefulness of Indian knowledge systems, which is reflected in his assertion of intellectual indebtedness to the proposed government project of educating the Indians. "We looked forward with pleasing hope to the dawn of knowledge thus promised to the rising generations." So, rising generations. "Our hearts were filled with mingled feelings of delight and gratitude. We already offered up uh, Thanks to Providence for inspiring the most generous and enlightenment nations of the West with the glorious ambition of planting in the arts and sciences of modern Europe. Right? Okay. Now, what I would like to stress here that it is not English so much as the sciences, natural philosophy, which is physics, chemistry, and medicine, which is seen to be brought to perfection in the West, on which stands Western superiority to other non-Western nations. And it is via English that it is not English education, but it is English, it is through English through which the arts and the sciences of the modern world can be grasped. And therefore, uh, Indians can reposition themselves within the larger understanding of knowledge systems. So it is not really, and I would like to, this is not really a Machiavellian project, right, where you produce Englishness. But you produce, and I think this is very important, you produce enabled, intelligent human beings who can assess for themselves the reality of the world. So in a way, you're also looking at a different kind of self-education. You're looking at a different kind of empowerment through education, which would allow Indians an equal position with that of the West. And we find that even in his most bizarre projects of the understanding of European settlements, which I'll come to in a bit. Uh, there is this very important understanding of India joining through education and through a new repositioning the modern world. So it is colonial. There is no doubt about it. It is coming out of a colonial moment where indigenous systems have lost the ability to change the existential the existential parameters of indigenous literate communities. Yes, it does not have the capacity to transform, right? And I think he understands this. One can call it false consciousness. One can call it the product of a colonized moment, which clouds a very powerful mind, perhaps. But nevertheless, there is this very important recognition coming out of this particular point in time, which is early 19th century, that indigenous knowledge systems will not be able to uh, uh, introduce practical sciences, the practical understanding of the sciences of modern Europe, which is a real engagement with and again here we do have some very important phrases linked to modernity, where we do have progress and quote unquote progress and quote unquote development, without which the the shall we say the position of Indians vis-a-vis the rest of the world would remain it would remain static. Okay, so I would definitely constantly turn on not English as the medium of instruction and only English, but through English, the access to the sciences, to the world of natural philosophy, chemistry, and medicine, anatomy, which is also very important. Uh, uh, so there is, I think, um, a different project which Roy seems to have in mind here. So, so this is the promise. Okay, we find Roy um, turning on this feeling of hopelessness. So let me now point out the level to which he understood the indigenous systems of the Indians themselves, failing the Indian themselves. Uh, let me be very clear here. This is the 19th century, not the 21st, and the 19th century uh, does present to the Indians, and this is the reason why I said it was just not uniquely Roy. It was also Fukan, it was also Barua, who were struck by the stark contrast between the values and the free thinking, empowered capacities of European individuals vis-a-vis the narrow-minded and very very well. One shouldn't say, but we will call it narrow-minded. I don't want to get into definitions of bigoted, but narrow-minded worlds of indigenous literate communities. So let me go back to Roy's own words to elucidate his dismay and his anguish a little bit more clearly than perhaps I have. Uh, we find that the government are sick, establishing a Sanskrit school under Hindu Pandits to impart such knowledge as is already current in India. Roy's total rejection of British institutions imparting Indian knowledge system has to be heard in his own words. This seminary, similar in character to those which existed in Europe before the time of Lord Bacon, can only therefore load the minds of the youth with grammatical niceties and metaphysical distractions of little or no practical use to the possessors or to society. The pupils there will acquire what was known 2000 years ago with the addition of vain and empty subtleties such as is already commented and already taught in all parts of India. Roy thus did not see any uh, positive effects of indigenous systems of knowledge, Sanskrit in particular, and he certainly did not wish to see these systems perpetuated in India through the East India Company's institutionalization of education. Institutionalization, yes. Contents which is European and European sciences, yes. To be taught by European scholars, yes, because Indians would not be able to understand the importance of these branches of the sciences: anatomy, chemistry, and natural philosophy or physics. Um, um, and he actually looks at the Vedanta, which is his point of takeoff in the way he positions the arguments vis-a-vis the missionaries. But Vedanta as uh, can I yes can I just finish this? Do I have a little bit more time?
Yes, certainly you have time. Yes.
Yeah, thanks. Uh, but for metaphysical arguments with no opponent inside, just plain metaphysical arguments through Vedanta, again would have no practical use, right? Okay, so we will come back to this point. Uh, because he is against, and I quote Roy, imaginary teaching. He is against imaginary teaching and would thus be best calculated to keep this country in the darkness for the next 100 years. All right. Uh, it was therefore much more in keeping with the improvement of the native population to promote a more liberal and enlightenment systems of instruction, embracing, and again the same stress, embracing mathematics, natural philosophy, chemistry, anatomy, to be taught by gentlemen of talent and learning, educated in Europe, and providing a college furnished with necessary books, instruments, and other apparatus. He is not talking about English education. He is not talking in this sense of English literature, which Macaulay is. Neither is he talking about creating an English culture in Indian minds. He is talking about a newly awakened repositioning of the Indian mind vis-a-vis knowledge systems and vis-a-vis the larger global context, which India had lost sight of, Indians had lost sight of, right? So this is also education, albeit in a more colonized way. It is a colonizing moment. It is the 19th century. And there has to be an appreciation as to how powerful this moment was in this confrontation between learning systems and um, knowledge, you know, and indigenous knowledge, where you do see uh, the older Rammohun Roy uh, looking at secularism, looking at rationality out of the Indo-Persian node, secular node, where Islamic scholars had taken rational thinking to new heights. So there is, of course, uh, a world which is being not perhaps left behind, but perhaps not being understood as useful enough to make Indians acquire new ways of uh, calibrating the world outside and reposition themselves vis-a-vis this. And to come back, I see I do not have too much time left, but let me come back to that point where I said that his most bizarre suggestion in 1932 in front of the Board of Commissioners, where he is speaking as a colonized subject. Before the inquiry commission set up by the British Parliament, right? Okay, so he is actually in a very, in a very marked way. He is locating himself as subject peoples. Yes, I would definitely grant that, right? Okay, he is not giving himself an autonomous, independent Indian position. Definitely not. This is 1832 in England in front of the Board of Commissioners. I'm quoting. From occasionally directing my studies to the subjects or events peculiarly connected with Europe, and from an attentive though partial practical observation in regard to some of them, I have felt impressed with the idea that in Europe, literature was zealously encouraged and knowledge widely diffused, that mechanics were almost in a state of perfection. I would like to repeat this. Mechanics was almost in a state of perfection, and politics in daily progress. That moral duties were, on the whole, observed with exemplary propriety, notwithstanding the temptations incident to a state of high and luxurious refinement, and that religion was spreading even amid skepticism and false economy. So Sarkar's charge that false consciousness. You do have even Roy talking in terms of a certain kind of falsity, right? But of course, not in the same key. And here, apart from making very important observations on the judicial and land revenue systems, which I obviously will not have time to comment on here, but European settlements European settlements in India, right? Okay, which had been till 1837 not been encouraged at all, was actually opened up by Rammohun Roy's suggestions. So here also we do have occasion to see how colonialism affects the marking of the Indian, yeah, a very powerful Indian mind, thinking Indian mind. But it is still thinking, right? Okay. And this is what I would like to underline again. It is still thinking, and it is thinking along lines of education, right? Okay. I just will give you a sense of the pros and cons, right? It is not just the project of having Europeans settle, it's also what they can bring to India, okay, right? What, by way of practical education, these Europeans settling in India can bring. And I will very quickly go through this. So this is obviously a very problematic, very problematic set of suggestions, but still, um, improved agricultural techniques. Hold your breath. Like indigo, the planters having brought new techniques of of agriculture. We are talking about the 1830s, right, when the indigo plantations were not as exploitative as the as the 1840s, 1850s onwards. But yeah, he is talking about new kinds of agriculture techniques, I believe giving peasants advances, giving peasants some kind of support for planting the crop, and supporting them through the growing season, right? Okay. Uh, uh, of bringing in the mechanical arts, by which the natives would, of course, benefit by free and extensive. So this is number two. By free and extensive communication with the various classes of the native inhabitants, the European settlers would gradually deliver their minds from the superstitions and prejudices which have subjected the great body of the Indian people to social and domestic inconvenience and disqualified them from useful exertion. And he is obviously talking about caste and caste restrictions on the activities of even the literate communities of India, upper caste in short. They have no useful exertion because of their inconvenient social and domestic ways of life. Number three, the European settlers being more or less on a par with the rulers of the country and aware of the rights belonging to the subjects of a liberal government and the proper mode of administering justice would obtain from the local governments or from the legislature in England the introduction of many necessary improvements in the laws and judicial systems, the benefit of which would, of course, extend to the inhabitants generally, whose conditions would thus be raised. He is talking in terms of a legal education, which would give the Indians a familiarity with legal grammar, with judicial grammar. So we are still on education as a lived experience. Number four, the presence, countenance, and support of European settlers would not only afford to the natives protection against the impositions and oppressions of their landlords and other superiors, but also against any abuse of power on the part of those in authority. The well, I don't even want to comment on this. This is wishful thinking, obviously. The European settlers, from motives of benevolence, public spirit, and fellow feeling towards their native neighbors, would establish schools and other seminaries of education for the cultivation of the English language throughout the country. We are looking at really a colonized imagination throughout the country for the diffusion of a knowledge of European arts and sciences, right? Whereas the bulk of the natives have no more opportunities of acquiring this means of national improvement. National, we are talking about the 1830s, national improvement, than if the country had never had any intercourse or connection whatever with Europe. And he only says that this kind of a complete lack of this European presence in the country in different parts was only absent in the metropolitan cities, where you do have a sense of the sciences, the European sciences, and the wonders of the European sciences which had the power, the strength to make life, to make the understanding of life very different, right? So he is talking in terms of different Indias. He is talking about an India which has not seen the impact of European sciences on everyday living, right? And he is obviously contrasting the urban spaces as denoting a very different kind of India. So already we begin to have two different Indias here. Settlers and their European connections would improve communications within the country, and the public and the government would become much better informed and consequently much better qualified to legislate on Indian matters than at present. Um, um, he is also, as I said, as a colonial subject, trying to position the British in an advantageous position vis-a-vis foreign attacks. And he said, invasions from external powers would make the positioning of European settlement very strategic, as European settlements closely connected with national sympathies and dependent on its stability for the continued enjoyment of their civil and political rights would obviously support the British administration in repelling foreign attacks. And finally, if, however, events should occur to effect a separation between the two countries, then still the existence of a large body of respectable settlers consisting of Europeans and their descendants professing Christianity and speaking the English language in common, I would stress here, in common with the bulk of the people, as well as possessed of superior knowledge, scientific, mechanical, and political, would bring that vast empire in the East to a level with other Christian countries in Europe, and by means of its immense riches and extensive population, and by the help which may be reasonably expected from Europe, they may succeed sooner or later in enlightening and civilizing the surrounding nations of Asia. Okay, now there are a few negatives here, right? This is obviously a pipe dream, and Roy understands that. And he says that racism is bound to intrude. And feelings of racism will not allow much of these so, so obviously seductive developments to actually come to fruition. Of racism in the Indian colonial context. And while he could fly past these colonial obstacles and look at this utopian world where the Indians would, in common with the European nations, have equal advantages of science and a common global language, English, which would allow Indians and India, not Bengal, Indians and India to position themselves within a larger global framework. I think this is pretty important, right? Okay. I think this is also flying past the colonial experience of being subjugated to England and thinking in terms of a separation between the two countries. I think this is also very important, right? Okay. So while we are on the subject of understanding the deep colonial moment, let us also think of how Roy, in 1832, in front of an imperial inquiry commission, right, okay, can actually think in terms of a separation between the two countries, where the Indians have actually acquired the sciences of the West and are at par along with the global language of power, English. The bulk of the people, the bulk of the population, wishful thinking, pipe dreams, of course. But there is, I think, a beyond colonization moment here that we have to look at, right? Okay. And therefore, to wind up the talk, I'm already 3 minutes beyond time. To wind up the talk, I would like to say here that education, in its individualistic freedoms, right, in its individualistic quests for empowerment, self-empowerment, both in terms of acquiring a new rational positioning, a new positioning vis-a-vis the rest of the world, is indigenous. Roy doesn't come from Western institutional training, even though sorry, even though he holds for institutional training for the younger generations. But he also actually thinks in terms of this kind of education, which would finally empower the Indians as a nation to position itself in a larger, broader global framework. Thank you. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Professor Mukhopadhyay, for that wonderful talk. And we can now open it up for questions from the audience. You could raise your hand and unmute your mic, or you can type it up in the chat box. I had a question of my own, if you wouldn't mind. Uh, Did Rammohun Roy have any opinions on the issue of English literary education in colonial Bengal, as in the introduction of English literature in the curriculum in schools run by the British government, and an issue that has been taken up with considerable detail in Gauri Vishwanathan's Masks of Conquest, where she looks at English literary education as a mask for colonial ideology. Did Roy have anything to say on this? You're muted, Professor Mukhopadhyay. If you could unmute yourself.
Um, I waded through 6 volumes before writing this paper, right? Okay. No, he doesn't say anything about literature. He is talking about mathematics, anatomy, natural philosophy, and chemistry. He is not talking about English literature at all. at least not to my knowledge. And I don't think he was, in that sense, enamoured. He was too busy following international events outside of the Indian borders, looking at the land. He was, he was, what can I say? I don't think he was a literary person, not in the way Vidyasagar was, right? He was I don't know how to say this, but I think he was a nationalist in a very, very weird sense, right? He is talking about the separation of ways. He is actually thinking of a time when India would separate from England, armed with the sciences. He is not talking about the literature so much, right? This is, and the English language. I think he is beginning to figure that English is a global language, which is very, very important. I kind of I really think that, there are some questions here that I can see, but I think that he is not really looking at Gauri Vishwanathan's point about literature so much. But if you think in terms of English, yes, English is the medium through which Roy is colonized, right? He cannot think in terms of Bengali becoming the international global language, right? He can only think in terms of empowered Indian nation with the bulk of the population speaking English, and therefore part of the global community. This is, I think, in 1832, it is a remarkable, fast forward to 2023.
Thank you so much. We have a question in the chat box. Yeah, I'll read it out. It says, "Doesn't Rammohun's belief that through English Indians can
Yeah.
get hold of the West arts and sciences and thus reach the global level sound similar to the civilizing mission discourse? Can you please elaborate a little more on this?"
Yes, well, of course. He is saying, I mean, with all respect to Roy, he is colonized, right? And he is talking in terms of the mission of think of the benevolence. Look, I'm just going to give you the quote back, just a minute. Hang on. I just let me give it. I said it. Just a minute. This is the point of reading it out. Where is that? Got it. Yeah. Listen to this. I hope you are listening. Right. So obviously this is colonized, right? He doesn't have. He doesn't have. He doesn't have an Indian position here, right? In the in 1820s, he really doesn't have an Indian position. Listen to what he's saying, right? The European settlers, from motives of benevolence, it is obviously the civilizing mission, from motives of benevolence, public spirit, and fellow feeling towards their native neighbors, would establish schools and other seminaries of education for the cultivation of the English language throughout the country and for the diffusion of knowledge of European arts and sciences, whereas the bulk of the natives, those residing at the presidencies and some large towns excepted, have no more opportunities of acquiring this means of national improvement than if the country had never had any intercourse or connection whatever with Europe, right? Obviously, he is talking about a civilizing mission. He's saying that their benevolence, right? When did the British have benevolence, right? Okay, but in spite of this huge colonial baggage, which his encounters with imperial racism, his encounters with racism in England, all these do not cure him of thinking of the future, at which point, if events should occur to effect a separation between the two countries, then still the existence of a large body of respectable settlers and their descendants professing Christianity and speaking the English language, in common with the bulk of the people, as well as possessed of superior knowledge, scientific, mechanical, and political. Please note, he is not talking of literature, scientific, mechanical, political, right, would bring that vast empire in the East to the level with other Christian countries in Europe, and by means of its immense riches and extensive population, and by the help which may be reasonably expected from Europe, right? Okay, they may succeed sooner or later in enlightening and civilizing the surrounding nations of Asia. Global power. Sounds very modern to me. Sounds very 2023, to me. Malini, of course it was marked. Rammohun Roy himself had to face racism in Bengal, on his own, motherland, right? The Bengal soil, as it were. Forget about his, exposure to racism in England, right? Of course, it was very marked, right? But uh, um, I think he is talking about, okay, European settlers as benevolent teachers and guides are. Here, there is a very peculiar class criteria operating in Roy's mind. He feels that it is the lesser human beings of England, of Europe, right, who are actually not as enlightened as the more educated Europeans are. It is they who are racist, right? It is they who are illiberal and irrationally prejudiced against foreign or native people of different countries, right? Whereas the enlightened Europeans, so he is actually, I think, more influenced by the Indological, Indological European fascination with India, right? In 1832, imperialism still had not peaked, right? Okay, so while he can use James Mill and History of British India, the imperial, the imperial discourse as an official position had not as yet taken root, and he is still way away from 1857. It is actually 1857 which completely tipped a very different understanding of imperialism, which Roy, of course, did not live to see. Uh, okay. Malini, are you? Have I answered your question? There is another a very nice question. Historian Amir Sen writes, Rammohun's polemical work Tufat is not harsh on Hinduism. Where is? Hang on, there are lots of questions. Historian Amir Sen writes, Rammohun's polemical work Tuhufat is not harsh on Hinduism or on Brahmins as a devious and self-seeking class, though he opens with a dramatic statement that falsehood is common to all religions. Do you agree on this point? Well, actually, I would not agree. He is actually looking at, he is actually looking at religion as not really necessary, right? As not really necessary to rational thinking, right? Okay. He is actually looking at a far, far more indological, indic understanding of rationality, which is beginning to push at a secular dimension of human existence, right? Where religion is not really essential, right? Okay. And this is from what I have been able to gather, this is coming out of a very radical strand of Islamic Sufi thought, right, where human love and human welfare is actually far more central to the social conscience, right, to the social, than polemical discussions on religious questions. Um, this is very peculiar. I don't want to push this constantly, and I certainly don't want to bring in Tagore here, right? But a later work of Tagore, a fairly heavy novel called Chaturanga, is juxtaposing the atheist brother and the believing completely Hindu older brother, younger brother, right? So you have the atheist older brother and the younger brother who is highly religious, and uh, the religious pundits being fed, Brahmins being fattened, Brahmins being central to the younger brother's world, is completely different in the world of the older brother, where uh, Muslims of the working class slums are fed to kind of counterbalance this excessive religiosity of his younger brother. So this is challenged by the younger brother, and he says, in answer to the accusations that he's an atheist, he says, no, 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 they are my gods. And the best part of my god is, instead of the food actually disappearing inside our stomachs, when I offer my god food, the food disappears into their stomachs. I just love watching my god eat. And this is I think what the radical secular understanding of of having, how shall I put it, of having a religious, well, Vivek, I shouldn't be bringing Vivekanand here, but it is, religion is social. Religion is a social action. Religion is not really ritual. I kind of, I think even with all his problems, I think even Vivekanand is saying that, right? That religion is social. Religion is not really rituals. So I think Rammohun is quite harsh on Hinduism as a set of rituals. He is not harsh on Hinduism later on as as a philosophical system of thought, which is spiritual, which actually sets the thinking individual free, but which is not stuck on ritualistic, meaningless practice. So yes, in that sense, I think Rammohun is pretty hard hitting in Tufat on Hinduism. Have I answered your question, Satyajit?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. Thank you so much.
Uh,
Yes, thank you so much, Professor Mukhopadhyay, for so patiently answering those questions. For a formal vote of thanks, may I now invite the co-PI of the project, Professor Pramod K. Nair.
Hi, Anindita. Thank you for finding the time. And despite all the anxieties over power cuts and botched internet connections, you managed to survive, and so did we. Well, it's wonderful to listen to you. I'm not quite sure whether I prefer to read you or listen to you. Uh, Given the range that you bring to your talks, from literary studies to the history of the disciplines and your intellectual history interests, it's gorgeous, especially the kind of splicing you are doing between Rammohun Roy, his emphasis on education, then his little toying around with religion, questions of divinity. It was wonderful, very educational for us, for those of us who do not know anything beyond Letter to Lord Amherst, uh, which I'm very grateful you did not cite. It's the only thing we all know of. That you, when you said there are 6 volumes, and it is, good God. I mean, I know that he, of course, wrote his work on Christianity and argued with the Archbishop of Canterbury, famous episodes. So it's been wonderful listening to you. I know you. It was a kind of rushed thing for you also with all your other work. We only hope that these kinds of talks are a respite from your other work of
Yeah.
calling faculty meetings and listening to people whine about not having internet connections in their offices.
Well, I don't have really. I'm speaking from the centers, from the department's office.
So, well, the humanities, one floor has the internet, the other doesn't.
Yeah,
So we have
we
the
have
same
some
problem.
offices. Yeah,
Yeah.
we have some offices thus privileged, but not all.
Thank you again, and thank you for the others, all of you who are here today to listen to Anindita. I am expecting Anindita to have to develop this into some paper which will eventually see light of day at some point, maybe history
Well,
and theory or something. Yeah, yeah.
thank you so
Thank you
much.
all. Thank you, Atul, for sharing this. Yep. All right.
Yeah.
Bye.